The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater Valley as Jake Morrison guided his black stallion toward the general store. The leather of his saddle creaked with each step, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the past 15 years of ranching in this remote corner of Montana. At 38, Jake had built himself a reputation as a fair but fierce man who protected what was his and helped those who couldn't help themselves. The town was quiet except for the gentle clatter of hooves and the distant sound of a hammer striking metal from the blacksmith's shop. Jake had come to town for supplies, nothing more. He needed grain for his horses, coffee for his long nights, and perhaps a new rope to replace the one that had finally given out after years of faithful service. It was meant to be a simple trip, the kind he made every few weeks without incident. As Jake tied his horse to the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store, a commotion from across the street caught his attention. Raised voices carried on the morning air, and Jake's trained ear immediately recognized the tone of anger mixed with fear. He had heard that combination too many times during his years as a young deputy before he took up ranching, and it never meant anything good. Turning toward the sound, Jake saw 4 young women standing outside the town's boarding house. They ranged in age from what looked like 16 to perhaps 25. Each bearing a striking resemblance to the others with their dark hair and green eyes. But it wasn't their appearance that made Jake pause. It was the way they huddled together, protective and afraid. While a large man in an expensive suit gestured angrily at them, the man was clearly not from around Clearwater Valley. His clothes were too fine, his boots too clean, and his manner too demanding for someone who understood the quiet ways of mountain folk. Jake watched as the man grabbed the arm of the youngest girl, causing her to cry out in pain. That was all Jake needed to see. Without hesitation, Jake crossed the street with long, purposeful strides. His boots echoed against the wooden walkway as he approached the group, his presence immediately commanding attention. The man in the suit looked up, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. "Problem here?" Jake asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that suggested the question wasn't really a question at all. "No problem that concerns you." "Stranger," the man replied, his grip tightening on the young woman's arm. "These are my nieces, and I'm simply collecting them for the journey home." Jake's eyes moved from the man to the 4 sisters, taking in their torn dresses, their frightened expressions, and the way they seemed to shrink away from their uncle. The youngest, still in the man's grasp, had tears streaming down her face, while the oldest stood protectively in front of her younger sisters, despite her own obvious fear. "Doesn't look like they want to go anywhere with you," Jake observed, his hand moving casually to rest on his belt, not far from the Colt revolver that had served him well over the years. The uncle, who Jake would later learn was named Cornelius Blackwood, straightened to his full height, trying to use his size to intimidate the rancher. "I don't know who you think you are, cowboy, but these girls belong to me. Their parents died 6 months ago, leaving them in my care, and I'll thank you to mind your own business." Jake studied the man's face, reading the cruelty in his small eyes and the greed in his expression. He had seen men like Blackwood before, men who saw other people, especially women and children, as property to be used rather than human beings to be protected. The scars on the girls' arms and the fear in their eyes told Jake everything he needed to know about what kind of care their uncle had been providing. "Well now," Jake said, his voice growing quieter, which anyone who knew him would recognize as a dangerous sign. "Seems to me these young ladies are old enough to speak for themselves. How about we ask them what they want?" Before Blackwood could protest, Jake addressed the oldest sister directly. "Ma'am, do you want to go with this man?" The young woman, who had auburn hair that caught the morning light and eyes that showed both intelligence and strength, despite her current circumstances, lifted her chin and spoke clearly. "No, sir. We do not want to go with our uncle. He has been cruel to us since the day our parents died, and we fear for our safety if we return to his house." Blackwood's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you speak such lies about me, Elizabeth? I have provided for you ungrateful girls, given you shelter and food when you had nowhere else to go. If you found the work I've given you difficult, Perhaps it's because you're too lazy and spoiled to understand the value of honest labor. Jake's jaw tightened at the man's words. But it was the way the youngest sister flinched at her uncle's voice that made his hands clench into fists. He had grown up with 3 sisters of his own, and the protective instinct that had been instilled in him from childhood now burned fierce and hot in his chest. "Mister," Jake said, stepping closer to Blackwood, "I think it's time for you to let go of the young lady and step back." "I will do no such thing," Blackwood snapped. "These girls are coming with me whether they like it or not. I have legal guardianship over them, and no small-town cowboy is going to interfere with my rights." Jake's eyes went cold. "Your rights? What about their rights? What about their right to be safe, to be treated with respect, to not live in fear?" Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Rights? They're women, cowboy. They have no rights except what their guardian grants them. And I am their guardian, appointed by the court in Denver? So, unless you want to find yourself on the wrong side of the law, I suggest you walk away right now." Jake glanced around the street, noting that a small crowd had begun to gather. Some of the townspeople watched with interest, while others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to involve themselves. Jake understood their reluctance. Clearwater Valley was a small community where people minded their own business and avoided trouble when they could. But Jake had never been good at walking away from trouble, especially when innocent people were being hurt. "Tell me something," Jake said to Blackwood, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "If these girls are so happy under your care, why are they here in Clearwater Valley? Why aren't they at home in Denver, grateful for your protection?" Blackwood's grip on the youngest sister's arm loosened slightly as he searched for an answer. "They ran away," he finally admitted. "Like the ungrateful children they are, they ran away from a perfectly good home because they didn't want to do their share of work around the house." "What kind of work?" Jake pressed, noting how the sisters exchanged glances filled with fear and shame. "Household duties," Blackwood said vaguely. "Cleaning, cooking, entertaining guests. The kind of work any woman should be grateful to do." Jake's experience as a deputy had taught him to read between the lines, and what he was reading now made his blood run cold. The way the sisters dressed in clothes that were too revealing for traveling, the way they flinched at their uncle's touch, the shame in their eyes, it all painted a picture that made Jake's protective instincts flare into something approaching rage. Elizabeth, the oldest sister, seemed to sense that Jake understood what their uncle wasn't saying. She looked directly into his eyes and spoke quietly but clearly. "Sir, our uncle has been forcing us to work in his saloon and gambling house. He made us serve drinks to men who touched us and said terrible things. When we protested, he said it was our duty to earn our keep. When we refused, he locked us in the cellar with no food for 2 days. Elizabeth!" Blackwood snarled, finally releasing the youngest sister's arm to point an accusing finger at the older girl. "How dare you fill this stranger's head with lies and exaggerations? You were employed in legitimate work, nothing more." "And when we tried to leave," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "he said he would have us arrested as thieves and prostitutes. He said no one would believe us, and that we would end up in prison or worse." Jake felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. He had encountered men like Blackwood before, during his time wearing a badge. Men who preyed on the vulnerable and used their power and position to hurt those who couldn't fight back. The fact that these were young women orphaned and alone made Blackwood's actions even more despicable in Jake's eyes. "Is that so?" Jake said, his voice so quiet that Blackwood had to strain to hear him. "You've been forcing these young ladies to work in conditions they found objectionable, threatening them when they tried to leave. And now you're here to drag them back against their will." "I am their legal guardian," Blackwood repeated. But there was less confidence in his voice now. "What I do with my wards is my business and my business alone." Jake nodded slowly, as if considering Blackwood's words. Then, without warning, he moved. His right fist connected with Blackwood's jaw with a solid thud that echoed off the buildings around them. The larger man staggered backward, blood streaming from his nose, shock and rage warring on his face. Well, Jake said, flexing his fingers as he looked down at the man who was now sprawled in the dust of the street. I reckon I just made it my business. Blackwood struggled to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding nose, his expensive suit now covered in dirt. You ca. 3 days had passed since Jake Morrison had sent Cornelius Blackwood packing from Clearwater Valley, and the four sisters had settled into temporary quarters at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Jake found himself visiting them daily, officially to check on their safety, but truthfully because he was drawn to their courage and resilience. Despite everything they had endured, the young women maintained their dignity and showed a determination to build new lives that both impressed and inspired him. Elizabeth had emerged as the natural leader among her sisters, and Jake learned that she had been the one to plan their escape from Denver. At 25, she possessed a sharp mind and a strength of character that reminded Jake of his own mother, who had raised 4 children on a frontier ranch after their father died young. The other sisters were Mary, 23, who had a gift for numbers and had managed the household accounts even under their uncle's cruel supervision. Sarah, 21, whose gentle nature couldn't hide a core of steel when her family was threatened. And little Anna, just 16, whose innocence had been damaged but not destroyed by their ordeal. On this particular morning, Jake was helping the sisters move from the cramped boarding house to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. The cabin belonged to an elderly widow named Mrs. Henderson, who had offered it rent-free in exchange for help with her garden and household chores. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it offered the sisters privacy and a chance to begin rebuilding their lives, away from the curious eyes of the townspeople. Jake was carrying the last of their few possessions when Elizabeth approached him with a troubled expression. "Mr. Morrison, might I speak with you privately?" Jake set down the bundle of blankets he was carrying and followed her to a quiet spot behind the cabin, away from where her sisters were arranging their new living space. Elizabeth wrung her hands nervously before speaking, a gesture that seemed odd from someone who had shown such composure in the face of her uncle's threats. "I've been thinking about what our uncle said before he left," she began quietly. "About coming back with federal marshals and proper warrants. What if he really can force us to return to Denver? What if all of this has been for nothing?" Jake studied her face, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "Elizabeth, you and your sisters are grown women. You have the right to choose where you live and how you live." "Do we really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our uncle has papers from a judge saying he has authority over us. And we don't have anyone to speak for us. We have no money, no property, no connections. We're nobody, Mr. Morrison. How can nobody fight somebody with legal documents and political influence?" The pain in her voice cut through Jake like a knife. He had spent the past few days focused on the immediate problem of keeping the sisters safe, but he hadn't fully considered the larger legal and social challenges they faced. In 1887, women had few rights and even fewer options when it came to challenging male authority, especially when that authority was backed by official documents. "Elizabeth," Jake said carefully, "what exactly did your parents leave when they died? Surely there was some property, some inheritance?" Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "There was. Our father owned a successful grain business, and our mother had inherited a substantial sum from her family. But when they died in that carriage accident, everything went into trust with our uncle as the administrator. He claimed that the business needed to be sold to pay debts, and that the inheritance had been lost in bad investments. We never saw any of the money." Jake felt a familiar anger building in his chest. "You think he stole it?" "I know he stole it," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Before our parents died, we lived in a beautiful house with servants and nice clothes. We attended good schools and had private tutors. Within a month of coming to live with our uncle, we were dressed in rags and working in his saloon. He said we needed to learn the value of hard work, but I think he just wanted to make sure we were too busy and too tired to ask questions about our inheritance." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what Elizabeth had told him. If Blackwood had stolen the sisters' inheritance, it added a new dimension to their situation. It wasn't just about escaping an abusive guardian, it was about reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. "Did your parents leave a will?" Jake asked. "Yes, but our uncle said it was lost in a fire at the lawyer's office shortly after their death." "Very convenient, don't you think?" Jake nodded grimly. He was beginning to see the full scope of Blackwood's scheme. The man hadn't just taken in 4 orphan nieces out of family duty, he had seen an opportunity to seize their inheritance and use the girls themselves as assets in his business. It was a level of calculated cruelty that made Jake's earlier punch seem entirely inadequate. "Elizabeth, I want you to know something," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of a solemn promise. "Whatever comes next, you and your sisters won't face it alone. I meant what I said the other day about doing what's right, and I don't make promises I can't keep." Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he stepped protectively in front of Elizabeth, but he relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Brady riding toward them with 2 other men as the riders drew closer. Jake saw that Brady's companions were strangers, one a tall, thin man in a black suit who had the look of a lawyer or clerk, and the other a stocky man with a badge pinned to his vest. Jake's stomach tightened as he realized what this probably meant. Brady dismounted and approached with a grim expression. "Jake, I'm afraid I've got some difficult news. This is Deputy Marshal Collins from Denver, and this is Mr. Pettigrew, who represents the territorial court system." The deputy marshal was a hard-looking man with gray hair and suspicious eyes. He studied Jake and Elizabeth with the cold assessment of someone accustomed to dealing with criminals and troublemakers. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of federal law. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you assaulted Mr. Cornelius Blackwood 3 days ago and prevented him from taking custody of his legal wards. Is that correct?" Jake met the marshal's gaze steadily. "I stopped a man from forcing 4 young women to go somewhere they didn't want to go." "If that's assault in your book, then I guess I'm guilty." "It is assault in my book," Marshal Collins replied coldly. "And it's also interference with lawful custody. Mr. Blackwood has filed formal complaints, and I'm here to ensure that this matter is resolved according to law." The lawyer, Pettigrew, stepped forward with a briefcase full of papers. "I have here the original guardianship documents, signed by Judge Harrison and witnessed by 2 court officers. Mr. Blackwood has full legal authority over these young women until they reach the age of 21. Or until they marry with his consent. 3 of the 4 are still under his legal control." Jake felt Elizabeth stiffen beside him, and he could hear her sharp intake of breath. The realization that only she, at 25, was legally free from her uncle's control must have hit her like a physical blow. "Furthermore," Pettigrew continued, "Mr. Blackwood has filed charges of theft against the young women, claiming they stole money and jewelry when they fled Denver. He demands their immediate return to face these charges." "That's a lie!" Elizabeth burst out, unable to contain herself. "We took nothing that wasn't ours. We barely had the clothes on our backs when we escaped." Marshal Collins held up a hand for silence. "Ma'am, you'll have your chance to answer these charges in court. But that court is in Denver, under Judge Harrison's jurisdiction. You'll need to return there to resolve this matter." Jake stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Marshal, these young women have testified that they were mistreated by their guardian. Doesn't that count for anything?" "Their testimony will be heard by the appropriate court," Collins replied. "But until then, the law is clear. Mr. Blackwood has legal custody, and we're here to enforce that custody. Where is he?" Jake asked, looking around as if expecting Blackwood to emerge from behind the trees. "Mr. Blackwood wisely chose to remain in town while we handled this matter," Pettigrew said with a thin smile. "He felt it would be better to let federal authority handle the situation rather than risk further unpleasantness." Jake's hands clenched into fists at the lawyer's smug tone, but he forced himself to remain calm. Violence had gotten him into this situation, and more violence wasn't likely to improve things. Sheriff Brady, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Marshal, what exactly are you proposing here?" The young women will return to Denver with us today, Collins announced. They'll remain in Mr. Blackwood's custody pending a hearing before Judge Harrison, at which time they can present any complaints they might have about their treatment. And what guarantee do they have that they'll receive fair treatment from this judge? Jake demanded. If Blackwood has enough influence to get federal marshals sent after 4 frightened young women, what chance do they have in his courtroom? Judge Harrison is a respected member of the territorial judiciary, Pettigrew replied stiffly. I resent any implication that he would show favoritism or bias in his court. I'm sure you do, Jake said dryly. But that doesn't answer my question. Elizabeth stepped closer to Jake, her voice barely audible as she wisped. The next 24 hours proved to be the most important day in Jake Morrison's life, though he wouldn't fully understand that fact until years later. As the sun rose over Clearwater Valley, Jake was already in town, pacing the wooden sidewalk in front of the telegraph office and waiting for it to open. He had spent most of the night thinking about Marshall, Collins's ultimatum, and the limited options available to him and the 4 sisters during his sleepless hours. Jake had developed a plan that was audacious, risky, and probably illegal according to the letter of the law. But it was also the only chance he could see to permanently free the sisters from their uncle's control while staying within the bounds of what an honest judge might consider reasonable. The key was finding the right judge and the right legal grounds to challenge Blackwood's guardianship. When the telegraph operator finally unlocked his door, Jake was the first customer of the day. He had prepared a carefully worded message to his brother-in-law, Thomas Brennan, who practiced law in the territorial capital. Thomas was a good man and a skilled attorney who had helped Jake navigate the legal complexities of establishing his ranch. More importantly, he was someone Jake trusted completely. The message was simple but urgent: need immediate legal help. 4 young women being forced back to abusive guardian in Denver. Claim inheritance stolen. Federal marshal involved. Can you come to Clearwater Valley today? Lives depend on quick action. Jake? After sending the telegram, Jake rode hard back to the sisters' cabin, where he found them sitting around the small kitchen table looking like prisoners awaiting execution. The contrast between their current despair and the hope they had shown the day before made Jake's heart ache with determination. I've sent for help, he announced as he entered the cabin. My brother-in-law is a lawyer, and if anyone can find a legal way out of this mess, it's him. Elizabeth looked up with weary eyes. Mr. Morrison, we appreciate everything you've done for us, but maybe it's time to face facts. Our uncle has money, political connections, and legal documents. We have nothing but our word against his. Perhaps it would be better if we just accepted our fate and stopped causing trouble for you and the people of this town. Jake pulled a chair up to the table and sat down facing the 4 sisters. Elizabeth, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Yesterday you told me that your uncle stole your family's inheritance. You told me that your parents will mysteriously disappeared in a convenient fire. Those aren't the actions of an honest guardian. They're the actions of a criminal who's been using his position to rob you and abuse you. But how can we prove any of that? Mary asked quietly. We were just children when our parents died. We don't know the details of their business affairs or what happened to their property. Maybe not, Jake replied, but I'm betting there are records somewhere. Banks, lawyers, business partners. Someone has to have documentation of what your parents actually owned and what happened to it after they died. And if we can prove that your uncle stole your inheritance, we can challenge his guardianship on the grounds that he's unfit to manage your affairs. Sarah leaned forward with the first spark of hope Jake had seen in her eyes all morning. Do you really think that's possible? I think it's worth trying, Jake said firmly. And I think we have one advantage that your uncle doesn't know about. He doesn't know that you found people willing to fight for you. He's used to bullying isolated young women who have nowhere to turn. He's not used to dealing with someone who's willing to punch him in the face and face federal marshals rather than let him hurt innocent people. Anna, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Morrison, why are you doing this for us? You don't even know us, and helping us could get you into serious trouble with the law. Why would you risk so much for strangers? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated. It involved his own sisters. His mother's teachings about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and a deep-seated rage at men who used their power to hurt the vulnerable. But there was something else too, something he was only beginning to understand. "Anna," he said finally, "sometimes you meet people who matter, even if you can't explain why. Sometimes you see something happening that's so wrong you can't walk away from it, even if walking away would be safer and easier. And sometimes you make promises that you have to keep, no matter what the cost." He looked around the table at each of their faces before continuing. "Your uncle thinks he owns you, that he can use you however he wants because some judge signed a paper giving him authority over you. But you're not property to be owned. You're human beings with the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And if the law says otherwise, then the law is wrong." Before any of the sisters could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he relaxed when he recognized the rider. Thomas Brennan had made excellent time from the territorial capital. Covering what was usually a 2-day journey in less than 18 hours, Thomas Brennan was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of intelligent eyes that missed very little. He had served as a territorial prosecutor before establishing his private practice, and he had earned a reputation for both legal skill and personal integrity. Jake had never been more grateful to see anyone in his life. After quick introductions, Thomas listened carefully as Jake and the sisters explained their situation. The lawyer asked detailed questions about the sisters' parents, their inheritance, and the circumstances surrounding Blackwood's appointment as their guardian. He took extensive notes and occasionally shook his head at some of the more outrageous details of their uncle's behavior. "Ladies," Thomas said when they had finished their story, "what you've described sounds like a clear case of fraud and abuse of guardianship. The problem is proving it in a way that will hold up in court." "Can it be done?" Elizabeth asked. "Possibly," Thomas replied carefully, "but it will require quick action and a bit of legal creativity. Jake, you said the federal marshal gave you until this afternoon to find a legal solution?" "That's right." Marshal Collins seemed like an honest man who wants to do the right thing, but he also has his orders. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Then we need to give him something he can work with, a legitimate legal challenge that provides grounds for delaying the enforcement of the custody order." The lawyer opened his briefcase and began pulling out various documents and legal forms. "First, we're going to file a petition challenging Mr. Blackwood's guardianship on the grounds of financial misconduct and abuse. Second, we're going to request an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding your parents' deaths and the disposition of their estate. Will that be enough to stop them from taking us back to Denver?" Mary asked anxiously. "If we file the petition in the right jurisdiction with the right judge, it should at least delay any enforcement action until a hearing can be held," Thomas explained. "The key is making sure we have standing to file the petition and a legitimate court to hear it." Jake frowned. "What do you mean by standing in jurisdiction?" "Standing means having the legal right to challenge the guardianship," Thomas replied. "Jurisdiction means finding a court that has the authority to hear the case. Normally, guardianship matters are handled by the court that issued the original order. In this case, Judge Harrison in Denver. The same judge who appointed our uncle as our guardian in the first place," Elizabeth said bitterly. "Exactly. Which is why we need to find grounds to move the case to a different jurisdiction, preferably one where Judge Harrison's influence is minimal and the presiding judge has a reputation for fairness." Thomas spread several maps on the table, showing the various territorial judicial districts. "The good news is that territorial law allows guardianship cases to be transferred to the district where the wards are currently residing if there are grounds to believe they would be in danger if returned to the original jurisdiction. And, we certainly have grounds to believe that," Jake said grimly. "Yes. But we need more than just the sisters' testimony. We need corroborating evidence or at least additional witnesses who can testify to the pattern of abuse. Jake thought for a moment, then snapped his fingers. The boarding house in Denver where Blackwood kept the girls before they escaped, Mrs. Patterson here in town, might know someone who worked there or witnessed what was happening. That's a good start. Thomas agreed. But we need something more substantial. We need evidence of the financial fraud, proof that Blackwood stole their inheritance. Elizabeth suddenly sat up straighter. Wait, there might be something. Before our parents died, they had business dealings with a man named Jonathan Pierce. He was a grain merchant who bought wheat from our father's company. After the funeral, Mr. Pierce came to see our uncle about continuing their business relationship. I overheard them arguing about money, something about debts that our uncle claimed our father owed. Do you remember any details? Thomas asked urgently. Mr. Pierce was angry. He said our father had never owed him anything, that in fact he owed our father a substantial sum for grain delivered just before the accident.